Hi folks, so today we're going to be working with the 5 hindrances. What are they, and how can we work with them and overcome them? I'm Doug Smith. I'm Study Director at the Secular Buddhist Association, that's secularbuddhism.org. And if you're interested in helping to promote a wiser, kinder, less stress-filled world, consider subscribing to Doug's Secular Dharma. We're going to deal with a question like this roughly once a week on Mondays. Try to have something that will be useful to you in your daily life and in your practice. So the 5 hindrances. These are hindrances that are classically hindrances to meditation. That is to say, they make meditation more difficult. If we're interested in absorptive jhanic meditation, which is very, very difficult, they can actually make it impossible. So getting an angle on these and trying to figure out what they are and how to deal with them is very important within a meditative context, but not only within a meditative context, as we'll discuss later. So what are the hindrances? There are 5 of them, classically. We can take them in 2 groups of 2 plus an extra. The first 2 are sort of hindrances of attachment. There is positive attachment, what might be called sensual desire within Buddhism. That is to say, attachment to pleasant sensations. There's also negative attachment, which we call ill will or aversion. And these are to painful sensations or painful memories, painful thoughts. The other 2 have to do with energy, basically, energy that hinders us. There is when we have too low energy, so slothfulness, tiredness, sleepiness, that kind of thing. And where we have what's called too much energy, and that is classically restlessness or what's called the monkey mind. And finally, the 5th one is doubt. Doubt can hinder us in our daily path. Now, of course, there's a sense in which we should doubt everything people say, but we have to take that with a grain of salt. In some sense, maybe we should doubt everything, but in another sense, if we doubt too much in the wrong ways, it can get in the way of our practice and actually really stop us dead cold. So the Buddha has a very famous simile of the lute player. If the strings are too tight on the lute, you can't play it properly. And if the strings are too loose, you also can't play it properly. So it has to be strung correctly with the strings in the right tightness. And that really does relate to both of these first 2 pairs. We have to find equanimity really between the extremes in order to find ourselves in a good place for doing meditation. Now, how do we overcome these 5? How do we get ourselves to a place where they're not being such a problem for us? And there are many techniques that we find in the Nikayas, in the early texts. And I'll be basically going through some of those here. The most important for all of them, and this is something to keep in mind throughout, we find actually in discussions of mindfulness in the Satipatthana Sutta, which is the Sutta on mindfulness. And that is that we have to be aware when these hindrances are present. If we don't realize that they're present and see them as hindrances, then we're not able to do anything with them. So the first step is to recognize them as hindrances, recognize them for what they are. And we can't really overstate the importance of that, because really we've been having these hindrances throughout our whole lives in many different aspects of life, and part of the problem we have with them is just that we don't really see them for what they are unless we're being mindful. So let's take the first one, which is usually called sensual desire or something like that within the context of the early texts. That is our grasping to pleasant sensations. Say we're in meditation, we feel really calm, we feel kind of blissed out. We can easily become attached to that kind of state and want it to continue, and that itself can disrupt our meditative equanimity, balance. So one thing we can do is to search for more tranquility. The blissed out state can create in us a kind of energy of wanting, which is its own kind of energy. If we can, say, counteract that by taking a deep breath and bringing ourselves back to a calmer state where we aren't so much grasping, that can be useful. We can also cognitively do what we might call an elements meditation. That is, consider the source of this pleasant state of mind, that it comes from a certain interaction of elements, of chemicals, of gases, of solids, and so on, that it's not personal, that it's something temporary that comes up from conditions that will leave due to conditions. In other words, we're trying to bring about wisdom in the mind, a wise state of mind, understanding the way these things come about and understanding that they're not permanent, and that therefore they should not be clung to. Now, as for ill will or aversion, these are similar kinds of states, but I suppose we could deal with them slightly differently. There is aversion, which is to say, let's say we're sitting in meditation, we have a pain in our knee, we have a pain in our back. With that pain arises an aversive mental state. Well, how do we deal with that? There are various ways we can deal with it. One way, again, is to think of an elements meditation, to think of the fact that this pain, this painful sensation, simply is coming about because of a certain confluence of causes and conditions having to do with certain kinds of chemical interactions in our nervous system, and that these things will eventually dissolve. And if we sit and focus our attention on the object of pain, we can even see it dissolve and reform and dissolve slowly over time. So this is to say, making arise a certain kind of wisdom about the process. Another example would be if we're distracted by an annoying sound. This is something that happens all the time in meditation. And if we think of the sound, the annoying sound, as simply a kind of a fluctuation in the air, sound waves coming at our ear, sound waves interacting with our inner ear, with our brain, that we depersonalize the sound and think of it just as a natural kind of occurrence in the world, that can help us to decrease the aversion we feel towards that kind of sound. If it's ill will towards a person, then one of the first things we can do, most famous things we can do, is loving-kindness meditation. Now, I did a video on loving-kindness meditation, which I'll include a link up to up here, and that'll help you understand what loving-kindness meditation is and how to do it. Some other ideas are that we can broaden the scope of our minds. Instead of thinking just of this one person who is annoying us, or that we have a bad memory of, or who we're dreading to see tomorrow. We can broaden the scope of our minds, think of other things, change the focus of our minds. That's another way we can deal with it. We can also focus on the person's positive qualities instead of focusing only on their negative qualities. A person is, of course, a confluence of different qualities, both positive and negative. If we train ourselves to look for the positive when we are caught up in ill will, that can help counteract the ill will from arising. Another thing that the Buddha notes many times in the texts is that we should consider in daily life associating with those people who don't display ill will terribly much. In other words, if we have an acquaintance or a friend who seems to be getting angry all the time, who displays a lot of ill will, particularly towards people around them, that we consider our own health, and we consider perhaps not associating with them so much, because the ill will of another person can rub off on us. Now, we have to be careful here, because we can also sympathetically wish to change them or to try to orient them in a different direction. And that can be a skillful and healthy thing to do too. But I think we have to weigh the pros and cons here of how much we want to be associating with people who display a lot of anger and ill will towards others. And of course, finally, when dealing with ill will or any of these negative states, it's really, really important to practice calming meditation. Taking a deep breath, just as in the prior case, can really help to dispel some of that negative energy. Now let's take the third, which has to do with drowsiness, sleepiness, those kinds of related mental states that can really sort of turn us off while we're in meditation. Very, very important to deal with those, and very difficult to deal with, really. In the texts, the Buddha talks a lot about fomenting a kind of an inner sense of light, of lightness. So if you can envision the sun on a bright day coming down on you, a bright room, even with your eyes closed, just try to envision it. That supposedly will wake you up, help wake you up. Now, personally, I don't find that very helpful, but at least, take it for what it's worth. If it's useful to you, then use it. It can certainly work for some people, I'm sure. Another classic example is to do either standing or walking meditation instead of seated meditation, because when you're standing up or when you're walking, that creates its own kind of energy which can wake you up. I think, frankly, that the most important thing within a contemporary context is to get sleep, is to sleep enough. I think a lot of us tend to be sleep deprived to a certain extent, and so when we get ourselves into a calm, quiet state with our eyes closed, we just automatically and naturally will start falling asleep. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's really what we should be doing. So I think if you're going to have an effective meditation practice, you should consider getting enough sleep the night before. And if you find that you're sleep deprived, do something about it. Try to reorient your schedule so that you get more sleep. And if that's not possible, then it may be useful for you to do meditation after some kind of physical exercise, when you really are awake, so you'll be less likely to fall asleep. Now, the other side of this energy, sleeping, having too little energy, is that we have too much, and then we get into the issue of restlessness, or the monkey mind, where our mind goes from one thing to another. We forget that we're meditating at all. We sit down, and 10 minutes later we realize we've been caught in a daydream somewhere. We're thinking about what we have to do that day. We're thinking about what happened to us yesterday. This is something that it's part and parcel of doing seated meditation, doing formal meditation. And honestly, this is the most difficult to deal with. In the Nikaya texts, it's said that you do not completely overcome restlessness until you reach the final goal, until you become actually awakened. So literally everybody, except for the very, very people who've completed the path, everybody else deals with restlessness, which is to say that there's no really sure method to getting rid of it. The thing that they say over and over is practice. Practice, in particular, practice breathing meditation. Practice anything that will calm you. By calming yourself, by practicing focus on the breath, or focus on whatever it is that you find yourself focusing on during formal meditation, that practice over time will tend to lead you to a place where there will be less restlessness than in the past. And I think that that's correct. I will say that it goes up and down, and the more that you meditate every day, the easier it becomes to do this. And in a related sense, if you're meditating for 10 minutes, it may be difficult to completely eradicate restlessness. In fact, impossible, but more difficult. If you're meditating for, let's say, half an hour, that first 10 minutes may be just as difficult. But you will find as you sit longer that the mind calms down. And I have heard many, or certain practice meditators, monastic meditators, saying that their mind doesn't become really still until after they've been seated for an hour or more. And of course, that's much more than most of us can do. But at least it gives us an idea of the path that needs to be to practice. Finally, there's the fifth one, which is doubt. And here I think it's important to distinguish like two different kinds of doubt. There's the little d doubt and the big D doubt. The little d is all the 10,000 doubts we have about our practice all the time. And then in the early texts, at least, the solution to that is through investigation. Through rational investigation, reasoning for ourselves, through asking questions of people who know more than we do. Perhaps nowadays reading books, listening to lectures, going on YouTube, so on. That can be very useful. And it's really a critical part of the path. And without it, we really couldn't get anywhere. Then there's the other kind of doubt, which we might call big D doubt, which is the doubt about everything that we're doing. Why are we doing this? What's the point of it? And there I think we have to be honest with ourselves, because no path to practice is right for everybody all the time. And if you find yourself overcome by these kinds of feelings of why am I doing this and this is not any good for me, push through it for a while. But if you find those doubts are really hindering you and you can't get around them, consider putting aside the practice for a while and see where you are. The Buddha always says, try it out for yourself. And I think most of us, or all of us who continue with the practice, find that it's useful. And so the doubt clears up on its own naturally. We have doubts, but we find that the practice continues to be useful. But if for whatever reason the practice isn't useful for you right now, put it aside for a while, come back to it later perhaps. And of course, in all of these cases, use the hindrances as fodder for your mindfulness practice. All mindfulness teachers will tell you that the hindrances themselves are part of why we practice, okay? And we can put them to good use, at least by being mindful of when they're present. We can sit with ill will and with frustration, or we can sit by being mindful of these things as they arise and pass. And so by doing that, we can transform what might be a frustrating sit into one that at least has some use. And finally, there's the question, is this only about meditation? Okay, am I only interested in overcoming these hindrances while I'm in formal meditation for 10 minutes, half an hour, whatever it is every day? And the answer is no. These techniques, these hindrances, are hindrances in daily life. They're hindrances whether we're walking down the street, whether we're talking to our neighbor, or whether we're on a cushion in a zendo somewhere. Because these are hindrances to mindfulness. And mindfulness is something we should have with us all the time, ideally all the time. So this is a practice that can go on in our daily life. If we're walking down the street and notice that ill will is arising, or that a certain kind of attachment to a positive mental state or physical state is arising, then try to deal with it as a hindrance and see where that gets you. And I think that you'll find that it's helping to increase your own sense of wisdom about the state of the world and about what's worth clinging to and what's not. And I think it'll also help your state of kindness with other people, to be aware of when ill will arises, to be aware of when aversion arises, and to be able to deal with that in the moment as it arises or soon after it's begun to arise, rather than only looking back at it afterwards and regretting it. And of course, I think dealing with restlessness and tiredness can also help us with our stress, as can dealing with the first two. So dealing with hindrances just is dealing with wisdom, kindness, and stress. It just is helping to increase our wisdom in daily life. It's just helping us to increase our kindness in daily life, and it's just helping us to decrease the stress in our daily life. So how do you work with the hindrances? And put them down in the comments below. I think that will be great not only for me, but for other people reading and listening to this video. I'll also include a link to a short essay that I wrote on this topic for the Secular Buddhist Association in the notes section down below, so you can read that if you find it useful. And if you find these kinds of talks, of studies about how to improve our wisdom and our kindness and how to decrease our stress in daily life, if you find them useful, consider subscribing to Doug's Secular Dharma. If you're new here, welcome, and I hope you enjoyed this. And if you're coming back, I'm really glad to see you here. And thanks so much for coming. I'll hope to see you on the next one.